O'Reilly.
You need parts? O'Reilly Auto Parts has parts. Need them fast? We've got fast. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Product availability. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Get 15% off a set of Brake Mess Select, Select Pro, or Import Direct brake pads and 2 rotors now at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Ooh, a spicy question. I
because
love
the
it.
writing is sort of everything, right? Like you kind of can fix plot holes, but if the writing is
So some readers love that, and some readers are like, "But I wanted more of this." So it's kind of a gamble.
Hello and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by a middle grade author who writes and illustrates her novels. It's the hilarious, multi-talented Louie Stowell. Hello.
Hello. I'm very excited to be on.
Thanks so much for coming. Jumping right in, you have found incredible success with the Loki series and Loki, a bad god's guide to making enemies. The latest one, book number 4, is out September 12th. So as of this airing, tell us a little bit about that book and the rest of the series.
I will, yeah. Love to talk about it. It's funny, actually, because I do a lot of talking to children normally. And so actually talking to adults about books is a fairly new thing for me.
Okay.
So I'm normally saying, well, this is what Norse mythology is, but I feel like I can probably assume that as knowledge. So yes, so it's a series of books taking the Norse myths and plonking them in the present day. And I've always loved that in fantasy, where you get kind of folklore or legend or myth, and it's sort of made to abut with, cars and gaming and the internet. So Loki has been sent down to Earth as a punishment for his many wicked deeds, and the main punishment is going to school and being forced to be 11, which, when you're thousands of years old and you've never had a bedtime before, is deeply insulting. So I sort of try to write them as though you can read every one as a standalone, but there is a continuity. So book 4 he's been there for about 4 months now. So each book takes place over roughly a calendar month. So he's sort of bedding into his life, and it has been, he's the reason he's on Earth is he's supposed to learn to be a better person. So he's sort of gradually learning that, but because I suppose the kind of conceit is he's a bad god, I can't have him get good too quickly. So in book 3, I made sure he backslid a bit.
Okay.
So book 4, he's got a lot to make up for, I think. And he encounters an enemy from his past. Only Loki makes enemies so easily he doesn't actually remember them all. So this one is sort of new to him. Someone he's insulted, who kind of considers themselves Loki's nemesis. But Loki's like, who are you again? And so it's an elf this time, which I was very excited to write because I'm a big fan of Tolkien. And elves in Norse mythology aren't one of the more sort of well-known areas, and there's not actually that many attestations of elves in Norse mythology. There's only one named elf that I've ever been able to find, and he's called Volund. He's also appears in kind of English stories as Wayland the Smith, and he's an elf prince, and he makes jewelry and amazing gadgets. So he's kind of what's his face that helped the guy get out of the labyrinth? My Greek mythology is not as good as my Norse mythology. Daedalus.
Oh, okay, yes.
So that kind of
Theseus.
Yes. So Daedalus, yes. So it's a bit like that, where he's a gadget guy. He makes kind of magic flying devices and things. But he's also
because Icarus, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of like that, but Volund as well is also the tech guy.
Okay, right.
So sort of he is has quite a sad story, really. He meets a lovely wife, but she leaves him. She doesn't just leave him; she turns into a swan and then leaves him. So he's already on the back foot. But I obviously had Elon Musk in my head at this point, because I was like, very divorced tech guy.
Okay.
and then so he then gets captured by a king who wants to make him work. So again, a bit like Daedalus, he's forced to work. Only this story is quite brutal. They sort of, sorry anyone squeamish, but they cut through his hamstring so he can't escape.
Oh.
Northsmith likes to go into very bloody details without warning. So he's trapped, and this king forces him to make him gadgets and jewelry and fancy stuff. And this elf is not taking it lying down, so he then massacres the king's sons and
Goodness.
turns them into jewelry. So he makes, like jeweled skulls and necklaces out of their various body parts. Obviously, I'm writing children's books, so I haven't put this guy as a main character. I've made his son be the main character, the main nemesis for Loki. Because I think characters who have, sort of very iconic parents, it's quite interesting. What must that be like? You've got a famous dad, but no one knows who you are. And also a famous dad who's quite unpleasant. And I thought he'd be quite an interesting kind of foil for Loki, because in my version of the story, he doesn't know who his parents are. We do in the myths, and it will come out eventually in the books. But for the moment, Loki is kind of unparented. So the idea that someone with very powerful daddy issues and someone who kind of thinks of himself as springing from nowhere, I thought they'd be a good pairing.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's interesting to speak about the you really like the idea of taking those kind of old stories or Norse stories, mythological stories, and putting them in the modern world. What do you think of the Marvel interpretation of the Norse gods?
It's not as good as the Ragnarok show on Netflix, which is amazing, which is kind of Norse myths in high school. And the giants are represented by like a big industrialist family who is polluting the local, what do they call them? Not lakes, like the big fjord.
Right, yeah.
And so it's all kind of done in a very small town way, which I think is quite interesting, because obviously, like, most Vikings would have had quite small town lives. You don't have that kind of, I mean, some of them went to big cities, but quite often, you would have lived in relatively small communities. So that feels like a kind of weirdly period appropriate approach.
Yeah.
I mean, Marvel is just its own thing. It's very much, I mean, they're not really gods. They're aliens. They're from a different planet. And it just means that every time I have to explain Norse mythology to children, I have to kind of deprogram them from the Marvel version.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of has very much accepted the Christian version of Loki at its word, and he's just kind of evil. He's not really a trickster in Marvel, or at least not in the films. Like, he is a bit more in the comics. So he's a bit more kind of wahaha, I'm going to take over the world. Whereas in the myths, Loki is more like he's a bit more of a kind of, he's much more ambivalent. He's a helper character. Oh, he helps the gods get out of trouble, but often they're in trouble because of him. So he's not that helpful. But he's definitely
sort of like, oops, I took it too far, and now
oops, exactly. And I feel like I actually think that's something kids can relate to, because I feel like there's often times when you realize you've taken it too far as a child, and you didn't quite sort of think through the implications of what you were doing. So yeah, I think that kind of, it sort of hits a particular part of childhood shame and guilt.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, while saying you need to deprogram people from the Marvel kind of approach to the Norse gods, you're obviously not going to go, like you say, it's for children. You're not going to go for the full like dismemberment, insane kind of thing that the original myths actually talk about.
I mean, I definitely refer to it. So the only time my editors told me no, too far, was when I was doing a World Book Day book. So, they give out free books to kids it's in March, and, everyone gets a free book. And there was a Loki one of those this year. And I did 3 short stories, and one of the short stories was a retelling of a myth. And the myth ends with Thor kind of battering some giants to death with his hammer. And I originally described this as it is described in the myth. And my editor was like, maybe that should happen off screen. So yes, I think Loki kind of alludes to it as like violent, hammery death, but you don't actually see Thor doing it. So I think it's kind of alluding to the violence and the fact that, for instance, the creation myth is one of violence. It's Odin dismembers a giant. and uses his body parts to make the world.
Yeah.
So I do kind of mention that, but again, I wouldn't go into a graphic description of it.
Oh, okay. So you do try and keep it kind of loosely accurate.
Yeah, because I think of it in terms of like the fairy tales I read as a kid. I very much had the pre-Disney ones.
Yeah.
I think the only one I had edited for me was Sleeping Beauty, because that one is actually too dark. But I had the version of Cinderella where the ugly sisters cut off their feet and that sort of thing, and had their eyes pecked out as well.
Yeah.
So I don't really believe in kind of toning things down too much, because I don't know how many children you know, but they're very bloodthirsty. And whenever I do kind of writing workshops, it's always kind of full on death. So while I don't want to traumatize any child, and I always, everything's in a kind of comic context, so it's funny. It's kind of Tom and Jerry violence, not serious violence. I think kind of, what do you think about what else they're doing with their time? They're playing computer games that are much more violent than the books they're reading. And I often think, well, if you're going to compete with computer games, you kind of got to give them something,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So the other is you're not going to completely the sort of Disneyfication of all of those grim fairy tales where they are so loosely the story that the original fairy tale writes. You're trying to keep it more like, no, you could, if you know what the story is, you know what the kind of stuff is happening that you've left out.
Yes, exactly. So there'll be some in one of the. I'm writing a book at the moment, and it's going to have the goddess Freya in it, and it's sort of there's a story of how she gets her necklace, and she, let's say, spends her time with some dwarves in order to get the necklace. I'm not going to retell that story, however, I will allude to it for the parents who know the story.
Okay, right. So basically, I mean, this is tapping on. I was going to go into this is about your kind of, you have a history of writing in nonfiction and like well-researched stuff. So this is tapping into that part of you where it's like, I imagine if you read something and you're like, oh, okay, well, this doesn't make sense with the original telling, but the way you're writing it is like, if you do know what the actual story is, you can say, this makes sense. She's just not covering it. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I have had, obviously the internet being the internet, I've had reply guys message me, always on Facebook, I don't know why, sort of complaining about the accuracy of the myths, and what they don't really understand is that you can change things within a myth to suit your story. So they were complaining about the fact that I don't seem to know who Loki's parents are. It's like, I know the myths. I'm writing a story where you don't give all the information right away. And there's some things where basically there's some things where there's a couple of potential interpretations, because there's no such thing as the real myth. We don't have anything written down from the time when they believed in the gods. We only have the Christian interpretation. So and some of that, you can believe it is what they actually thought, because of things like the poetic forms are quite hard to rewrite. So if the Christians were writing it down, they probably wrote down the oral version, probably. However, that kind of idea of authenticity just isn't there, because we don't have, there's no Odyssey, you know what I mean? And even the Odyssey isn't authoritative, because again, these stories come from all oral versions, and who's to say which one should have primacy? So I'm always quite wary of implying that there's a kind of true version of the myths, like a, how like in French there's the Académie Française that tells you which versions of French are supposed to be correct. There's no version of that for myth, or indeed for the English language. We kind of it's very much a kind of like, it's a patchwork. It's kind of how we've interpreted things. And I've used a group of core texts for myself. I tried to stick to stuff that was kind of roughly the same period, and I haven't used much later folklore. And just for a sort of personal sense of internal consistency. And so, for instance, with elves, there is much later folklore, and indeed, like, folk belief potentially now. And I haven't really gone with that version. I've gone more with the version where you get it, the story of Volund and the kind of sense of magic and violence. Rather than little people living in hills.
I know what you mean. Because at the same time, you're writing for children, like you say, you're competing with a lot of other mediums. You need to grab attention and not you can't afford to have the J.R.R. Tolkien thing of like a whole chapter to describe a hilltop, you know?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's funny because obviously I loved Tolkien as a kid, and I loved all the descriptions of. I mean, this made me a lifelong lover of walking. But yes, there is. I don't know if there's a very good comedy video summarizing the idea of how Tolkien pitched the Lord of the Rings.
O'Reilly.
You need parts? O'Reilly Auto Parts has parts. Need them fast? We've got fast. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Product availability. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly. Auto Parts.
I highly recommend looking it up, and it's basically it's just about how the entire thing is about walking.
Yeah. I can see that.
Yeah.
I'd love to get back onto you.
Sure.
You've been writing a long time for this kind of age group, this middle grade. I'd love to rewind and hear about where you first started. Like, where did you first get your foot in the door of publishing, and was it a long road to get there?
It was an incredibly long road, such that I feel like people don't always believe me, but it really was. Because you have people, because obviously, like, we've got access to a lot of writers talking about their journeys now, which is great. It's really, really great. But often I'll have people saying, "Oh, it took me so long to get published. It took me 5 years. It took me 10 years." And that's bush league, frankly, you know. So I completed my first novel right after university, so I was 21.
Okay.
And I didn't get my first novel published until I was 40. So it was definitely a really long road. And some of that long road was just me enjoying my 20s and not being very proactive. And I think I sort of didn't do much of putting myself out there, because I didn't know that was a thing you could do. I suppose it was sort of pre-social media, so, early 2000s. And so I submitted various books, and then there was one, I think it took about 8 years to get close, but it's still no. And I had several agents over that time that I kind of parted ways with for various reasons. And so it wasn't until I got my second agent that I got a book deal. And I think basically a lot of the stuff I was writing, I think I sometimes just missed the boat. So, for instance, I wrote a book about vampires, but it was too soon after Twilight. And then I also didn't understand the fact that there are not just age groups for kids, but there are genres. So I think one of the first books I wrote was a YA, but it wasn't a YA in genre terms. It was just happened to be about teenagers.
Okay.
But I didn't understand that YA had to be about emotions and romance and stuff. So it was just like a straight out zombie comedy about being on work experience. So it was like none of the stuff that YA readers actually want. But so that was actually my first successful submission. I went on submission with this YA. Everyone said no to it, but an editor said, I'm not going to publish this, but what else have you got? So I guess my first kind of success was also a failure, because it was that book didn't get published. But basically I kind of came up with a list of other books that I had either written versions of or just had come up with on the spot. So I think I picked, this was Tom Bonnick, who was then at Nosy Crow. I pitched him about 5 ideas, one of which was actually Loki. And he took on 2 of them. So one of which was a series that became The Dragon in the Library. And one of which was, again, it was originally a series, but ended up being a single book called Otherland, which was sort of very loose cousins of the very first novel I ever wrote, but basically had nothing in common except the villain.
Okay.
Actually, no, it didn't even have the villain in common. It had one minor character in common, but it was sort of nominally the same world. So yes, it was a very kind of complicated journey for me. There was no kind of one moment where I'd made it. And my first book came out in 2019. That was The Dragon in the Library. It was kind of younger middle grade, that one, 7 to 9, heavily illustrated by a guy called David Ortu, which was a lovely collaboration, actually, because when you're a prose middle grade writer, you don't really meet your illustrator or anything, but we found each other on Instagram and started sending each other messages, which I'm sure the designer loved. But he added really interesting details that I wouldn't have thought of in terms of character design. So that was quite exciting, actually. And then so then the pandemic happened, and basically, so my first book, it sold. I think it sold like 10,000 copies or something. It was, it's fine, like it was good. But then the pandemic happened, and my next like 3 books just sunk without trace. So during the pandemic, I was working at Penguin at the time. So I've had kind of publishing jobs along the side of all of this. So I started working. I did advertising first, but then I did publishing from about 2005. I worked in-house at Usborne, where I wrote non-fiction. So it's kind of, I always recommend it as a publishing job if you're someone that actually wants to write, because they basically pay you to sit there researching and writing non-fiction. It's sort of almost like being in academia rather than publishing, because you don't really do any of the business side. You just sit there writing the books. So that was kind of sort of nerdily fascinating. I did a lot of books on space. And that
it's all for children as well, isn't it?
All for children, yeah. And then I got more of a traditional publishing job. I got headhunted by Penguin and went to be editorial director at Ladybird. And that was like a kind of fascinating introduction to the hardcore business side of publishing. And while I was at Penguin was when I wrote Loki. And it was basically a version of the thing I'd pitched originally to Nosy Crow, but I kind of came up with a new twist, because the original version, he was a child version of Loki who then goes down to Earth as a child. And then the version I then came up with was, no, he's an adult god who becomes a child. And I just realized that was immediately funnier, because, like adults having to be children, sort of reverse big, or Freaky Friday, I suppose, but no opposite number. And yeah, so that was my kind of pandemic book, and I think it was trying to write something funny when everyone was very miserable, and just cheering myself up, really. So I had a very different experience of submission with that one. It was I don't know if it's exactly, I never really understand the distinction between auctions and preempts and stuff. There was basically various people interested. It was all very quick, and the reason I went with the publisher I did, Walker, and my editor Non, was other people had really good ideas for it, but Non was like, so it's going to be illustrated, right? Why don't you do the pictures? And I've never illustrated anything before, except the odd kind of comic or cartoon. So that was kind of the vision. Well, I guess I appreciated their faith in me, but also I think being able to draw it myself meant that I could shape the world in a more total way than I could if another illustrator was doing it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. As in, it's entirely one focused vision as opposed to a shared.
Yeah.
Vision.
And I do like a shared vision, but I think realistically in publishing you don't get to work as collaboratively with your artist as you might like anyway. Yeah. So obviously I can collaborate easily with myself, and it also meant that I could adjust the text to fit the art and the art to fit the text. So if a joke wasn't landing in text, I could turn it into art and vice versa.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean. Because obviously then it just gives you a lot more tools in terms of the comedic elements.
Yeah, and also in terms of integrating the image and the text, kind of playing with reading order, playing with text and subtext. So something might appear in the pictures that doesn't appear in the text, which gives you a different insight into the characters. Like often Loki's not very emotionally honest with himself, but sometimes that honesty comes out in the pictures.
Okay, that's really interesting.
So he'll be like, I'm fine, and then there's a picture of him looking very sad, but hopefully funnier than that.
Awesome. We're going to get back onto this because I had some more questions about this, but it's that time in the podcast where we head over to the desert island. So I will ask you, Louie, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book do you hope that it would be?
This is actually quite an easy answer for me. It'd be Lord of the Rings.
Okay, great.
It's my favorite book as a child. I had read it really quite young, because I saw the Ralph Bakshi film when I was about 3.
Is that the animated one?
Yeah, the animated one from the 70s.
Yeah.
I saw it in the cinema, so they must have been on sort of re-release. Absolutely terrified by the Black Riders. And then I was sick, and my dad told me the entire story to Lord of the Rings. and then I read it when I was about 8, I think.
Wow.
But I also listened to the dramatized version, which I think is better than the book. It was a BBC production from the 80s, and it had Ian Holm as Frodo and Bill Nighy as Sam.
Wow.
But I didn't work out for years that it was Bill Nighy because they called him William Nighy in that. And it sort of penny dropped years later. So I've basically been rereading Lord of the Rings every year all my life.
Wow.
I haven't got bored of it. So I feel like I think that would be a solid desert island choice.
Okay, I have to ask then, what do you think of the original trilogy movies?
Unfortunately, they hit exactly the wrong time for me because they hit when I was at university, and I'd just gone out of my peak Tolkien obsession, but I was still obsessed enough to be really critical.
Right.
And what I didn't like was the music. I felt like the music was culturally wrong. It felt a bit too Celtic, and look, Tolkien isn't drawing on Celtic mythology, he's drawing on Norse mythology. He's trying to create a much more kind of, I guess, for want of a better word, English mythology. So the Celtic thing made it feel like it was trying to be a different mythology than it was. And I realised that's an incredibly anal complaint, but it really bugged me when I was like 19.
The music ones won multiple Oscars, I believe.
Yeah, I know. But also, I think I was really like, I didn't want anything left out, and they left out Tom Bombadil, and I was furious.
That's the biggest complaint between fans of the book, is they left out Tom Bombadil, because apparently it was filmed as well. They cut it.
Oh, was it? I didn't even know that. Yeah,
I heard at least it was in there at one point.
There's an enjoyable fan conspiracy about him actually being the true villain of the book, and they kind of put together all these pieces that he was actually kind of behind Morgoth and behind Sauron. So maybe Rings of Power will do that. You never know.
Well, I'm almost scared to ask. Like, I'm assuming you didn't like The Hobbit.
I never actually watched it because everyone said it was so awful. I very much enjoy all the gifs of the elves and Thranduil and stuff. So I feel like just enjoying the gifs is fine, and I never need to see it.
Yeah. I watched Rings of Power season 1. I am waiting for someone to tell me if season 2 is good or not before I watch it.
I know I'll get around to it. Basically, season 1, I just think I don't really like what they've done with Galadriel's storyline. I get what they were trying to do, but I just don't think it worked. I feel like if you're going to do kind of young, angry Galadriel, you still got to have that, like, I don't know, wildness in there, and I don't think she was wild enough. Because there's my favourite bit in Lord of the Rings is when Galadriel kind of talks about what it would be like if she took the ring.
Yeah.
And she's, I'd be beautiful and terrible as the morning and night. All shall love me and despair. And I was like, I need that in Rings of Power, Galadriel. Like I feel like I want to know that her wild youth was properly wild and not just looking a bit constipated.
Yeah, you want her to be like, you want to see both sides of the coin, right? You want to see her being amazing and achieving loads of great things, but also being chaotic and like messing things up. And they obviously tried to do that, but it just didn't feel correct the way they did it.
She just felt like a bit of a kind of like young fool. And I just think I wanted more of a like where's my with nail and eye Galadriel? You know what I mean? Where's my like messy Galadriel?
Yeah, but that you can root for her even though she's a mess.
Yeah, because maybe she'd be more eye than with nail. But no, actually, no, I want her to be with nail.
Amazing. So I have some questions coming up about we're going to do more about being an author and an illustrator and how that affects the process and stuff like that, as well as breaking into the middle grade market, which is a wildly competitive market. But that's all going to be in the extended episode available through the Patreon.
Excellent.
Yes.
I haven't actually told my agent about that one yet, though.
Okay. So. Cool that you're looking to kind of flex different muscles and do stuff like that. Well, thank you so much, Louie. That brings us to the end of the episode. It's been so cool chatting with you and hearing about everything that you've been up to and your kind of experiences with writing and publishing and all that cool stuff. It's been great.
Yeah, no, great to chat to you too.
And for anyone wanting to keep up with what Louie is doing, you can follow her on all socials at Louie Stowell, or the one social that she's not that is on TikTok at Wanna Watch Things. Or you can head over to the website www.louiestowell.com. Loki, A Bad God's Guide to Making Enemies is out September 12th, and you can get that in all the usual places. To support this podcast, like, follow, and subscribe. Join the Patreon for bonus content, and subscribe for the ad-free extended episodes. And check out my other podcast, The Chosen One's Another Trope, if you've got time. Thanks again, Louie, and thanks to my amazing Patreons and everyone listening. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Get 15% off a set of Brake Best Select, Select Pro, or Import Direct brake pads and 2 rotors now at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Oh, 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 O'Reilly Auto Parts.